To understand the breakers, you first have to understand the lie that Newport, Rhode Island, told itself in the 1890s. The ultra-wealthy families of New York, the Astors, the Belmonts, and the Vanderbilts, did not call their massive limestone palaces mansions. They didn't call them castles. They called them cottages. It was a terrifying display of false modesty. It was a flex. It was a way of saying, this 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo lined with platinum and marble. Oh, this is just my little summer shack. You should see my real house in Manhattan. Newport was not a vacation town. It was a battlefield. It was a narrow strip of rocky coastline where the American aristocracy went for 8 weeks every summer to wage war against each other. The weapons were not guns. They were dinner parties, ball gowns, and architecture. And in this war, there was one family that possessed the nuclear option, the Vanderbilts. By 1890, the Vanderbilt family was no longer just rich. They were an economic superpower. The patriarch, the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built the fortune on steamships and railroads. He was a brute, a brawler, a man who famously said, "The public be damned." He left behind a pile of money so large that it distorted the gravity of the American economy. But by the third generation, the rough edges of the Commodore had been polished off. His grandson, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was the head of the family. He was a different breed. He wasn't a brawler, he was a saint. He was serious, pious, hardworking, and deeply religious. He ran the New York Central Railroad with the efficiency of a machine. He taught Sunday school. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He was the good Vanderbilt, and he needed a house that reflected his seriousness. In the 1880s, Cornelius II had purchased a property in Newport called the Breakers. At the time, it was a large, shingle-style wooden house. It was beautiful, rambling, and flammable. It sat on Ochre Point, a cliff that jutted out into the Atlantic Ocean, where the waves crashed violently against the rocks, hence the name. For a few years, it was a happy home. It was a place where Cornelius could escape the crushing pressure of running the railroad. It was a place where his wife, Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt, a tiny woman with the social ambition of a Napoleon, could host her teas. But fire is the great equalizer of the Gilded Age. In an era of gas lamps, open hearths, and wooden frames, every millionaire lived in fear of the spark. On November 25, 1892, the spark came. A fire started in the kitchen. It moved with terrifying speed. The sea breeze off the Atlantic acted like a bellows, feeding the flames. Within minutes, the wooden shingles were turning into ash. The family was not there, but the house was destroyed. It burned to the foundation. The old Breakers was gone. For most people, this would be a tragedy. For Cornelius Vanderbilt II, it was an opportunity. He stood on the blackened cliff, looking at the smoldering ruins of his summer home, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided that he was done with wood. He was done with things that burned. He wanted permanence. He wanted a monument that would last as long as the Roman Empire. He didn't just want to rebuild. He wanted to escalate. He wanted to build the most magnificent, fireproof, indestructible house in the history of the United States. And he wanted it done yesterday. To build a house fit for an American king, Cornelius hired the architect of kings, Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was the dean of American architecture. He was the first American to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He was the man who had brought the French style to New York. He was old, he was grumpy, and he was brilliant. He was also the favorite architect of the Vanderbilts. He had already built Marble House for Cornelius's sister-in-law, Alva, just down the street. Cornelius called Hunt to his office and gave him the brief. It was simple and impossible. First, the house had to be fireproof. No wood, no shingles. It had to be built of steel, stone, and brick. It had to be a fortress. Second, it had to be large enough to house his massive family. He had 7 children and a staff of 40 servants, and still have room to host a ball for 500 people. Third, it had to be finished in 2 years. This timeline was insane. In Europe, a palace of this scale would take 10 or 20 years to build. The stone carving alone usually took a decade. Cornelius wanted it in 24 months. He wanted to be eating dinner in the dining room by the summer of 1895. Hunt accepted the challenge. He saw it as his magnum opus. He was nearing the end of his life, and he wanted to leave a mark that would never be erased. He looked at the site on Ochre Point, the 13 acres of prime cliffside land, and he threw away the cottage aesthetic entirely. He looked to Italy for inspiration. He sketched a palazzo. He modeled it after the palaces of Genoa and Turin in the 16th century. It would be a 4-story square of limestone arranged around a massive central courtyard, the Great Hall. It wouldn't look like a vacation home. It would look like the seat of a government. The construction began in 1893, and it wasn't a build. It was a military invasion. The sheer logistics of the breakers are hard to comprehend. Because Cornelius was obsessed with fire, the house has no wooden skeleton. It is a steel cage, similar to a skyscraper. The steel was manufactured in Pennsylvania and shipped to Newport. Then came the stone. They didn't use local stone. They imported limestone from Indiana, but not just the exterior. The interiors were lined with marble from Italy, Africa, and France. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was the chairman of the New York Central Railroad. He used his own trains to prioritize the materials. He created a supply chain that moved mountains of rock across the continent at record speed. The site at Ochre Point became a hive of activity. Hundreds of laborers descended on Newport. They dug a massive hole in the cliff for the foundation. They poured concrete. They riveted steel. The noise was deafening. The neighbors, the Astors and the Golets, watched from their lawns in horror and fascination. The Vanderbilts weren't just building a house. They were changing the skyline. But Richard Morris Hunt knew that he couldn't just build a big box. It had to be refined. He didn't want it to look like a factory. He wanted it to look like it had been transporting from the Renaissance. So he did something that became a hallmark of the Gilded Age. He outsourced the rooms. He hired different firms to design and build different rooms in Europe. The breakfast room was designed in France. The dining room was designed in Italy. The library was designed to look like a specific room in the Château de Maisons-Laffitte. These rooms were built in Europe by artisans. They carved the paneling, they gilded the moldings, they cut the marble. Then they disassembled the rooms, packed them into crates, put them on steamships, sailed them to New York, put them on a barge to Newport, and reassembled them inside the steel shell of the breakers. It was a jigsaw puzzle of global proportions. The billiard room alone is lined with grey-green marble and yellow alabaster. The limits of geography did not apply. If Cornelius wanted a specific shade of gold that only existed in a quarry in Algeria, they went to Algeria. The pressure on the workers was immense. They worked around the clock. Electric lights, a novelty at the time, were strung up so work could continue at night. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was paying the bills, and he was a man who watched the ledger. He wasn't cheap, but he was exacting. The budget ballooned. The initial estimates were high, but the final cost was astronomical. The house cost $7 million in 1895. In today's currency, calculating for labor and material value, it would cost hundreds of millions to replicate. In fact, it is likely impossible to replicate today because the craftsmanship simply doesn't exist anymore. You cannot find 200 stone carvers who know how to carve a Corinthian capital by hand. But there was a darker cost to this speed. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was a workaholic. He was running the biggest railroad in America during a financial panic, the Panic of 1893. He was dealing with strikes, with stock crashes, and with the immense burden of the family name. And at the same time, he was micromanaging the construction of the biggest house in the country. He was grinding himself down. He was 50 years old, but he looked 70. He saw the breakers as his refuge. He believed that if he could just get it finished, if he could just get to Newport and sit on the loggia and look at the ocean, he would find peace. He was building a sanctuary that was slowly killing him. By 1894, the limestone shell was complete. The roof, covered in terracotta tiles, was on. The house stood 70 feet high. It dominated the coastline. From the ocean, it looked like a fortress guarding the American continent. The scale was terrifying. The house has 70 rooms. It has 33 bathrooms. It has 27 fireplaces. The Great Hall, the central atrium, rises 45 feet into the air. It is essentially an indoor town square. The technology hidden inside the walls was cutting edge. It had a complex electrical system. Edison was a contemporary. It had an elevator. It had a system of tunnels underneath for the servants to move coal and ice without being seen. It was a machine for living, disguised as a palace for dreaming. As the summer of 1895 approached, the final touches were being applied. The gold leaf was being burnished. The platinum leaf, yes, platinum, because gold was too gaudy for certain rooms, was being applied to the wall panels. Alice Vanderbilt, the tiny queen, was preparing her guest list. She was ready to unveil the house to society. She wanted to crush her rivals. She wanted to show Mrs. Astor that the Vanderbilts were the new royalty. But as the scaffolding came down, revealing the stark, white purity of the limestone, the house felt heavy. It didn't have the whimsy of the wooden cottages. It was imposing. It was cold. It was a statement of power, not of joy. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built his phoenix. He had risen from the ashes, but he had built a cage, a 70-room, limestone, gold-plated cage, and he was about to lock himself and his family inside it. The fire was gone, but the ice age of the Vanderbilt's social dominance was just beginning. The doors were about to open, and the world was about to see what unlimited money and unlimited ego could build in 24 months. The construction of the breakers was less like building a home and more like assembling a Swiss watch on the scale of a cathedral. While the limestone exterior rose rapidly, a stark white fortress against the Atlantic fog, the true war was being fought inside the steel cage. Richard Morris Hunt, the aging dean of American architecture, was orchestrating a logistical ballet that spanned 2 continents. He knew that the Vanderbilts did not just want a house that looked European. They wanted the actual physical substance of Europe transporting to Rhode Island. To achieve this, Hunt utilized a technique that became the defining characteristic of the Gilded Age, but is almost unheard of in modern construction: the period room assembly. He didn't just hire local carpenters to build a library. He hired entire workshops in Paris and Rome. Firms like Jules Allard and Sons, the premier interior designers of France, were essentially given carte blanche to create royal chambers in their workshops. They carved the oak paneling, gilded the plaster, cut the marble, and assembled the fireplaces in France. They would invite the Vanderbilts to inspect the rooms in a warehouse in Paris, and once approved, the entire room, floor, ceiling, walls, and fixtures, would be crated up, numbered, and shipped across the ocean to be reassembled like a massive, priceless jigsaw puzzle inside the limestone shell at Newport. This method explains the disorienting, almost schizophrenic brilliance of the interior. Walking through the front doors of the breakers is not entering a single cohesive home. It is walking through a curated museum of European architectural history. The heavy iron gates, 30 feet high and weighing tons, swing open to reveal a front door that seems designed to keep out an army. But once you cross the threshold, the scale explodes. Great Hall is the heart of the machine. It is a room that defies the domestic scale entirely. Rising 45 feet into the air, it was designed to mimic an open-air Italian courtyard in Genoa. The walls are not wood or plaster. They are carved Caen stone and marble. The ceiling is a painted sky, creating the illusion that you are standing outside in the Mediterranean sun, even while the Rhode Island winter howls against the windows. But the illusion of an open courtyard was purely visual. The Vanderbilts were obsessed with comfort. The room was heated, lit by electricity, and sealed against the elements. At the center of this hall lies the grand staircase, a cascading river of stone that splits and curves upward. It was designed for one specific purpose: the entrance. In the 1890s, a woman's social power was often determined by how she entered a room. Alice Vanderbilt wanted a staircase that allowed her to descend like a queen, visible to everyone in the hall below, her diamond stomacher catching the light of the massive chandeliers. Tucked under this staircase is a fountain, but not a garden hose trickle. It is a replica of a fountain from the Boboli Gardens in Florence, carved from marble, bubbling gently in the middle of a private living room. Radiating off this central hub are the public rooms, and each one was an exercise in one-upmanship. The dining room is perhaps the most aggressive display of mineral wealth in North America. It is a cavern of Cipollino marble and gilded bronze, but the dominating features are the 12 monolithic columns of red alabaster. These were not pieced together. They were hewn from single blocks of stone. In antiquity, red alabaster was the stone of emperors, reserved for the temples of Rome. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had them shipped to Newport to watch over his soup course. The room is 2 stories high, featuring a massive table that could seat 34 guests comfortably. The ceiling depicts the goddess, Aurora, bringing the dawn, a subtle reminder that the Vanderbilt railroads ran on a schedule as reliable as the sun. Moving through the house, the mood shifts violently. The billiard room is a study in masculine aesthetics, lined with grey-green marble and yellow alabaster, giving it the cool, slick feel of a sea cave. The mosaics on the floor are hand-laid, thousands of tiny tiles creating intricate patterns that would be walked upon by men smoking cigars and playing pool. It was a man cave, built with the budget of a small nation. Then there is the music room. If the rest of the house is Italian-heavy, this room is French-light. It was designed and built by Allard in Paris, then shipped over. It is a jewelry box of a room, intended for recitals and dances. The walls are lined with gold and silver. The furniture is Louis XVI. It feels fragile, airy, and incredibly expensive. The floor is parquet, a complex geometric pattern of rare woods, but the true engineering miracle of the music room is not visible. During balls, the furniture would be cleared and the carpets rolled up. The room was designed to vibrate with the sound of the orchestra, a perfect acoustic chamber for the private concerts the family hosted. However, the room that truly captures the Vanderbilt ambition is the morning room. It sits on the northeast corner of the house, designed to catch the first rays of the sun coming over the Atlantic. While other millionaires gilded their walls with gold leaf, the Vanderbilts decided that gold was perhaps too common. For the morning room, they chose platinum. The wall panels are decorated with silver and platinum leaf, giving the room a cool, shimmering, metallic glow that is utterly unique. It was a room designed for the ladies of the house to write letters and drink tea, surrounded by a metal more precious than the rings on their fingers. But beneath the marble and the platinum, the house was a modern machine. Richard Morris Hunt was an old man, but he was not a Luddite. He understood that a house of 70 rooms needed a nervous system. He wired the entire structure for electricity, a technology that was still in its infancy in residential construction. To be safe, because the family didn't fully trust this new magic, the chandeliers were fitted with both gas jets and electric bulbs. If the generator failed, they could simply light the gas. The house was also equipped with an elevator, one of the first residential elevators in the country, allowing the family to move between the 4 floors without exerting themselves on the marble stairs. The kitchens were industrial marvels, vast spaces with 20-foot ceilings, lined with white tile for hygiene, featuring massive cast-iron ranges that burned coal 24 hours a day. The ventilation system was a masterpiece of passive engineering, using the central Great Hall as a chimney to pull cool ocean air up from the basement and vent hot air out through the skylights, a natural air conditioning system that kept the stone palace habitable in the humid Newport summers. The speed at which this complex machine came together is baffling. Ground was broken in 1893. By the summer of 1895, the furniture was being unpacked. In just 2 years, thousands of tons of Indiana limestone had been quarried, shipped, and carved. The roof was tiled. The plumbing was laid. The electrical wires were strung. It was a feat of project management that relied on the brute force of the Vanderbilt railroad logistics. Cornelius II treated the house like a rail line. Delays were not options. When materials were needed, they were prioritized over commercial freight. The house ate resources at a rate that would have bankrupted a lesser tycoon. But as the final crates were unpacked in early 1895, tragedy struck the architect. Richard Morris Hunt, the visionary who had translated the Vanderbilt ego into stone, was dying. He had pushed himself to the limit to finish the project. He lived just long enough to see the house mostly completed, passing away in July 1895, just weeks before the grand opening. The Breakers stands as his final statement, his tombstone written in limestone. He had taken the chaotic, new money of America and given it the gravitas of old Europe. He had proved that Americans could build palaces that rivaled the Medicis. As the summer of 1895 arrived, the house stood ready. The staff of 40 servants moved in, occupying the claustrophobic attic rooms on the 4th floor, a stark contrast to the opulence below. The coal bins were filled. The wine cellar was stocked. The massive iron gates were oiled. The cottage was finished. Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his wife Alice arrived to take possession of their new summer home. It was a moment of supreme triumph. They had lost their wooden house to fire, and they had responded by building a fireproof mountain. They had spent $7 million, an unfathomable sum, to ensure that no one in Newport could ever look down on them again. But as they walked into the great hall for the first time, their footsteps echoing on the marble, they weren't just walking into a home. They were walking into a machine that would demand a rigid, crushing perfection from everyone who lived inside it. The walls were stone, the doors were iron, and the social expectations were about to become just as hard and unyielding. The stage was set for the queen of the gilded cage to begin her reign. The summer of 1895 in Newport did not begin with a whisper. It began with a coronation. When the massive iron gates of the Breakers finally swung open to admit the carriage of Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt, the social hierarchy of the United States shifted on its axis. For years, the undisputed queen of New York society had been Mrs. Carolina Storr, the woman who famously claimed there were only 400 people in New York worth knowing, because that was the number of people who could fit into her ballroom. But as Alice stepped out of her carriage and looked up at the towering 70-foot limestone cliff of her new home, she knew the math had changed. Mrs. Storr had a ballroom. Alice Vanderbilt had a palace. Alice was a woman of terrifying contradictions. Physically, she was tiny, almost bird-like, often disappearing under the weight of the massive jewels and heavy brocades she wore. But socially, she was a leviathan. She was a woman who had been bred for this exact moment. She understood that in the Gilded Age, a house was not a place to relax. It was a weapon. The Breakers was not built for comfort. It was built to intimidate. It was a machine designed to process guests, to crush rivals, and to display the limitless power of the Vanderbilt fortune. The inauguration of this machine took place in August 1895. Ostensibly, it was a housewarming party to celebrate the debut of her daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt. In reality, it was a display of force. The guest list was the holy writ of American society. To be invited meant you existed. To be excluded meant social death. On the night of the ball, the house was transformed into a realm of electric fantasy. The great hall, with its 45-foot ceiling, was filled with palm trees imported from Florida. The electric lights, still a novelty that made people gasp, were blazed at full power, reflecting off the yellow marble and the platinum walls until the house glowed like a lighthouse on the edge of the Atlantic. An orchestra was imported from New York, set up in the gold and silver music room. The food was prepared by a French chef who commanded a kitchen staff of 30. But the true spectacle was the hostess. Alice Vanderbilt appeared at the top of the grand staircase, pausing for effect. She was known for her electric light dress, a costume she had worn to a previous ball that actually lit up with batteries hidden in the hem. But tonight she wore the armor of a matriarch. She wore pearls the size of grapes. She wore the Vanderbilt diamond. She descended the stairs not like a mother greeting friends, but like a monarch granting an audience. For the guests, the experience of the Breakers was overwhelming. They were used to luxury, but this was something else. This was scale. To walk from the front door to the dining room was a journey. To sit in the library required navigating a room that felt larger than a train station. The house forced you to behave differently. You couldn't slouch in a chair that had been carved for a French king. You couldn't whisper in a hall with 40-foot acoustics. The architecture demanded posture. But once the party was over and the guests retreated to their own cottages, the real reality of life at the Breakers began. And it was a reality of grueling, relentless labor. We often imagine the Gilded Age as a time of leisure, but for a woman like Alice Vanderbilt, leisure was a full-time job that required the stamina of a marathon runner. The daily routine at the Breakers was a rigid military operation. The day began not when you woke up, but when you were dressed. And getting dressed was the primary activity of the day. A woman of Alice's station did not dress once. She dressed 7 or 8 times a day. First, there was the morning dress, something simple made of cotton or linen for breakfast. But you couldn't wear that to play tennis, so you changed into a tennis outfit. But you couldn't wear that to lunch, so you changed into a luncheon gown, usually silk, often with a hat. After lunch, it was time for the promenade. This was the daily ritual where the elite of Newport would get into their carriages and drive up and down Bellevue Avenue, nodding at each other. For this, you needed a carriage dress, something elaborate, designed to be seen from a distance, accompanied by a parasol to protect the skin from the vulgar sun. When you returned from the drive, it was tea time. That required a tea gown, a softer, looser garment, but still incredibly expensive. Then perhaps a rest. But by 7:00 p.m. the real work began. Dinner dressing. This required a maid, a corset laced tight enough to restrict breathing, and a gown of heavy velvet or satin weighed down with pounds of jewelry. And finally, if there was a ball later that night, you might change again. Alice Vanderbilt lived her life inside a changing room. Her body was a mannequin for the family fortune. The closet in her bedroom at the Breakers was not a closet. It was a warehouse of couture, and the house was designed to facilitate this. The servants moved through the hidden corridors, carrying the endless stream of laundry, pressing the silks, polishing the diamonds, ensuring that the queen was always ready for the next scene. The cottage life was defined by a specific kind of public privacy. The Breakers sits on a cliff, exposed to the ocean on 3 sides, but it is also exposed to the public. The cliff walk, a public path, runs right along the edge of the property. This meant that while the Vanderbilts were sitting on their loggia, trying to enjoy the sea breeze, tourists and locals could walk by just a few yards away and stare at them. Most people would find this intolerable. They would build a high wall, but the Vanderbilts did not build a wall on the ocean side. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the public to gawk. There was a perverse pleasure in sitting on the terrace of a $7 million palace, drinking tea from china that belonged to a defunct monarchy, while the common man walked by in the dust. It reinforced the separation. The architecture said, "You can look, but you can never touch." Inside the house, the atmosphere was chilly, both temperature-wise and emotionally. Stone is a cold material. Even in the summer, the massive marble halls of the Breakers held a damp chill. The great hall, for all its beauty, was draughty. The family often huddled near the massive fireplaces, trying to find warmth in a house designed for visual impact rather than thermal comfort. The social rituals were equally cold. The calling card system was the algorithm of Newport society. You didn't just drop by a friend's house. You drove your carriage to their front gate. You handed your card to a footman, who handed it to the butler, who placed it on a silver tray. If the lady of the house was at home, a social fiction. She was always home, but she might not be receiving. You might be admitted for 15 minutes of stiff conversation. If she was not at home, you left the card and drove away. It was a way of interacting without actually connecting. It was a system designed to filter out the undesirables and maintain the purity of the circle. Alice managed this system with ruthless efficiency. She kept ledgers. She knew who had called, who had been invited, and who had been snubbed. Her office at the Breakers was the command center. She wasn't just running a house. She was running a corporation of influence. But the true victims of this golden cage were the children. Cornelius and Alice had 7 children, but by the time the Breakers was finished, the dynamics of the family were shifting. The children, Gertrude, Alfred, Reginald, Gladys, grew up in a museum. Imagine being a 10-year-old boy in a house where you are forbidden to touch the walls because they are made of platinum. Imagine being a teenager in a house where you cannot bring a friend over without a footman announcing them. The nursery was on the third floor, separate from the parents. The children were raised by nannies and governesses. They saw their parents by appointment. They would be brought down at tea time, dressed in miniature versions of adult clothes to be paraded before the guests. They were props. They were the heirs to the railroad, the future dukes and duchesses of American industry, and they had to look the part. Gertrude Vanderbilt, the eldest daughter, felt this pressure acutely. She was a brilliant, sensitive, artistic soul trapped in the body of a debutante. She hated the parties. She hated the endless changing of clothes. She hated the superficiality of Newport conversation. She would often retreat to her room, looking out at the ocean, dreaming of a life where she could be judged for her talent, not her last name. The Breakers was her prison. It was a beautiful prison, filled with art and music, but it was a place where she was constantly watched. She was watched by her mother, watched by the servants, watched by the press, and watched by the suitors who were lining up to marry the Vanderbilt money. She wrote in her diary about the intense loneliness of being surrounded by hundreds of people. The house was so big that you could scream in one wing and no one would hear you in the other. And then there were the servants. To run a house of 70 rooms required a staff of 40. But unlike the servants in an English manor, who often had a generational loyalty to the family, the staff at the Breakers were part of a modern industrial machine. They were hired professionals. There was a French chef who was a tyrant in the kitchen. There was an English butler who managed the wine cellar like a bank vault. There were footmen who were hired specifically for their height and their calves, which looked good in silk stockings. These servants lived a parallel life. They lived on the fourth floor, in small hot rooms tucked under the eaves. They used the back stairs. They used the tunnels. They were the invisible hands that made the magic happen. They polished the marble floors every night while the family slept. They ironed the newspapers so the ink wouldn't stain the Commodore's fingers. They set the table with a ruler to ensure the forks were perfectly aligned. The hierarchy downstairs was just as rigid as the hierarchy upstairs. The butler would not speak to the lowly scullery maid. The chef would not dine with the footmen. It was a mirror image of the class system, reproduced in the basement. As the 1890s drew to a close, the Breakers was functioning perfectly. It was the undisputed center of the Newport season. Every August, the lights would blaze, the orchestras would play, and Alice Vanderbilt would stand at the top of the stairs, looking down on her kingdom. She had won. She had the biggest house, the most expensive jewelry, and the most exclusive guest list. But victory in the Gilded Age was a fragile thing. The house was built of stone and steel, designed to last forever. But the people inside it were flesh and blood. And while Alice was busy fortifying her social position, the foundation of the family was beginning to crack. The Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was not well. The work, the stress, and the sheer weight of the fortune were crushing him. He would sit in the library, surrounded by millions of dollars of rare books, staring blankly at the wall. The machine he had built was running perfectly, but the operator was breaking down. The curse of the Commodore was about to descend on the limestone palace, proving that you can build a fireproof house, but you cannot build a grief-proof life. The lights were about to dim, and the cold ocean wind was about to feel much, much colder. The summer of 1896 should have been the season of ultimate triumph for the House of Vanderbilt. The Breakers was complete. The limestone was gleaming white against the blue Atlantic, and the social machinery of Newport was humming in perfect synchronization with Alice Vanderbilt's guest list. But inside the platinum-lined walls of the morning room, and deep within the cavernous silence of the library, the air was thick with an unspoken dread. The architect of this American empire, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was disintegrating. The man who had willed this 70-room palace into existence, who had moved mountains of Indiana limestone and redirected the logistics of the New York Central Railroad to build a fireproof fortress, was suffering from the most human of failures, exhaustion. He was 53 years old, but to the few people allowed to see him up close, he looked like a man of 80. The stroke that struck him in 1896 was not a sudden bolt of lightning. It was the inevitable collapse of a structural beam that had been bearing too much weight for too long. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had spent his entire life trying to be good. In a family defined by the rough, brawling piracy of his grandfather, the Commodore, Cornelius II had burdened himself with the crushing weight of respectability. He ran the railroad, he ran the church, he ran the charities, and he ran the family. He worked 18-hour days. He micromanaged the construction of the largest house in America. He absorbed the stress of the financial panics, the labor strikes, and the endless public scrutiny. And in return, his body simply quit. For the last 3 years of his life, the Breakers ceased to be a showpiece of power and became the most expensive nursing home in the world. The image is haunting. The master of the universe, paralyzed and mute, being wheeled through the great hall. He sat in a wheelchair, rolling over the intricate mosaics that had been laid by Italian artisans, staring up at the painted sky of the ceiling, unable to speak, unable to command, a prisoner in his own limestone cage. The servants, trained to be invisible, now had to avert their eyes from the tragedy of the invalid king. The silence in the house became heavy, suffocating. The guests who came for tea would whisper, terrified that the squeak of a wheel or the sound of a cough would shatter the illusion of Vanderbilt invincibility. On September 12, 1899, the end came. Cornelius Vanderbilt II died at his townhouse in New York, but his spirit haunted Newport. He had enjoyed his completed masterpiece for less than 4 summers. He had spent $7 million, hundreds of millions in today's currency, to build a monument to his legacy, and he barely lived long enough to see the furniture unpacked. His death triggered an earthquake in the family that revealed just how deep the cracks in the foundation really were. The reading of the will was a moment of shocking brutality that exposed the ruthless nature of Alice Vanderbilt and the rigid moral code of the era. The natural heir to the throne was the eldest son, Cornelius Vanderbilt III. By the laws of primogeniture and tradition, he should have inherited the bulk of the fortune, the headship of the railroad, and the breakers itself. But Cornelius III had committed the ultimate sin in the eyes of his parents. He had married for love, and he had married the wrong woman. He had fallen in love with Grace Wilson. To the modern observer, Grace Wilson seems perfectly acceptable. She was wealthy, she was a socialite, she was from a good family. But in the hyperspecific, microscopic social calculus of Alice Vanderbilt, she was poison. She was considered fast. She was older than Cornelius. She had been engaged before. The Vanderbilts viewed her as a social climber who was trapping their son. When Cornelius III announced his engagement, his father, despite being on his deathbed, suffered a final apoplectic rage. He disowned his son. It was a biblical exile. When the will was read, the brutality was laid bare. Cornelius III was stripped of the majority of his inheritance. Instead of the $60 million or more that he expected, he was given a trust fund of $1 million and the interest on another $1 million. He was cut out of the leadership of the railroad. He was cut out of the breakers. The bulk of the fortune, nearly $70 million, along with the title of head of the family and the ownership of the breakers, skipped the eldest son entirely and landed on the shoulders of the second son, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt. Alfred was 22 years old. He was a handsome, sporting, fun-loving young man who had no interest in running a railroad and even less interest in ruling society. Suddenly, he was the richest young man in America, burdened with a crown he didn't want, sitting on a throne that had been stolen from his brother. The feud of the Corneliuses tore the family apart. It dominated the gossip columns for years. It pitted mother against son, brother against brother. Alfred, to his credit, tried to fix it. In an act of immense generosity that proved he was perhaps the only decent human being in the saga, Alfred voluntarily gave his brother $6 million from his own share, trying to balance the scales of their father's wrath. But the damage was done. The house of Vanderbilt was divided. The good Vanderbilt had left behind a legacy of bitterness. While the brothers fought over the money, the women of the house were fighting a different war, a war against boredom and irrelevance. Alice Vanderbilt, now the Dowager Queen, retreated into a deep, performative mourning. In the Victorian era, widowhood was a career. Alice draped herself in black crepe. She shrouded the furniture at the breakers in black. She turned the house into a mausoleum. For the younger children, Gladys and Reginald, growing up in the breakers during this period was like growing up in a funeral parlor. But the most tragic figure of this era was Gertrude Vanderbilt. Gertrude was the eldest daughter, and she was a woman of profound depth and talent trapped in a world that valued neither. She was an artist. She wanted to sculpt. She wanted to paint. She wanted to live a bohemian life in Paris. Instead, she was trapped in Newport, forced to change her clothes 7 times a day and make small talk with people she despised. Gertrude looked at the breakers and saw a prison. She wrote in her journals about the suffocating weight of the luxury. She described the house not as a home, but as a stage set where she was forced to play a role she hadn't auditioned for. To escape, she eventually married Harry Payne Whitney, a man of immense wealth from another dynasty. It was a good match on paper, a merger of millions. But Harry was a sportsman, a polo player, a man of the physical world, while Gertrude was a woman of the spirit. Their marriage was complicated, often lonely, and marked by long separations. Gertrude eventually found her escape not in Newport, but in Greenwich Village, where she founded the Whitney Museum of American Art. She used her Vanderbilt money to build a legacy that had nothing to do with railroads or limestone cottages. She proved that the only way to survive the breakers was to leave it. Meanwhile, the new master of the house, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, tried to bring some life back to the limestone corpse. Alfred was the people's Vanderbilt. He loved horses. He loved coaching, driving teams of horses pulling carriages. He wasn't the pious, serious man his father was. He wanted to have fun. Under Alfred's reign, the breakers loosened up, but only slightly. The shadow of his mother, Alice, still loomed large. She lived on the 2nd floor, controlling the social calendar, ensuring that the protocols were followed. But Alfred brought a tragic glamour to the estate. He was the celebrity of the family. He was the one the newspapers loved. But the curse of the Commodore seemed to hunt the men of the family. Alfred's life was marked by a strange, magnetic attraction to disaster. He was supposed to be on the Titanic. In 1912, he had a ticket. He was ready to board. At the very last minute, due to a change in plans or perhaps a premonition, he cancelled. His luggage went down with the ship. He did not. He survived the ice, but he could not escape the war. 3 years later, in 1915, Alfred boarded another ship, the RMS Lusitania. He was travelling to England to volunteer to offer his fleet of vehicles to the Red Cross. He was trying to do something noble, something good like his father. When the German torpedo struck the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt behaved with the stoic heroism that his father would have been proud of. Witnesses reported that he was calm. He was not fighting for a lifeboat. He was seen giving his lifebelt to a woman who didn't have one. He was seen tying a lifebelt onto a nurse. He spent his final moments trying to save others, standing on the deck of the sinking liner, a millionaire in a suit, accepting his fate. Alfred's body was never found. The master of the breakers, the man who owned the fireproof fortress on the cliff, vanished into the cold dark of the Atlantic Ocean. The news of Alfred's death shattered the illusion of safety that the breakers was meant to provide. Cornelius II had built the house to be indestructible. He had built it to keep the fire out. But he couldn't build walls thick enough to keep out the stroke, the family feud, or the German torpedo. With Alfred gone, the house passed into a strange twilight. Alice Vanderbilt, the Alice of the breakers, was now an old woman. She had buried her husband. She had buried her son. She had alienated her eldest son. She was left alone in the 70-room palace, surrounded by 40 servants and the ghosts of her ambition. The youngest daughter, Gladys, eventually inherited the house, but by then the world had changed. The income tax had arrived in 1913. The Great War had destroyed the social order of Europe. The Gilded Age was bleeding out. The parties at the breakers continued, but they felt different. They felt like a reenactment of a bygone era. The cottage had become a burden. The sheer cost of running it, the coal, the electricity, the staff, the taxes, was becoming difficult even for the Vanderbilts. The fortune, divided and subdivided among so many children and grandchildren, was diluting. The river of money that the Commodore had unleashed was starting to run dry. But the most damning verdict on the breakers came from the family itself. They stopped coming. The younger generation didn't want to spend their summers in a limestone museum where they had to dress for dinner. They wanted to go to the Hamptons. They wanted to go to the Riviera. They wanted to wear bathing suits and drink cocktails and listen to jazz. They didn't want to sit in the great hall, shivering in the draught, listening to the organ play hymns. The breakers had been built to assert dominance, to scream to the world that the Vanderbilts were the kings of America. But within 20 years of its completion, it stood as a monument to a kind of life that no one wanted anymore. It was a dinosaur, a beautiful, majestic, platinum-lined dinosaur standing on the edge of the cliff, watching the meteor coming. As the 1920s roared into existence, the silence at the breakers grew louder. The curse wasn't a supernatural hex. It was the simple, brutal realization that you can buy a $7 million house, but you cannot buy a happy family. The gold leaf was still shining in the morning room, but there was no one left who wanted to sit there and watch the sun come up. The era of the builders was over. The era of the preservers, and the struggle to keep the lights on, was about to begin. By the middle of the 20th century, the breakers had become a shipwreck. It was not a literal wreck. The limestone walls were still standing, the roof was still holding, and the platinum leaf still shimmered in the morning room. But it was a social and economic shipwreck. The tide of history had gone out, leaving the massive, 70-room Leviathan stranded on the cliffs of Newport, high and dry in a world that no longer had any use for it. The Gilded Age, the era that had birthed this monster, was dead and buried. It had been killed by the Income Tax Amendment of 1913, wounded by the Great War, and finally finished off by the Great Depression. The sheer, staggering wealth required to operate a machine like the breakers simply did not exist anymore. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the second, had possessed a fortune that could absorb the cost of 40 servants, hundreds of tons of coal, and endless repairs. But his heirs were living in a different reality. The fortune had been divided, taxed, and diluted. The Vanderbilt economy had crashed. Gladys Vanderbilt Shachny, the youngest daughter of the Commodore, was the woman left holding the keys. She loved the house. She had grown up in it. She had married a Hungarian count, Laszlo Shachny, and lived a life of European glamour, but her heart was in Newport. When she inherited the breakers after her mother's death in 1934, she inherited a white elephant of epic proportions. The expenses were terrifying. In the 1940s, the tax bill for the property alone was tens of thousands of dollars a year, money that was being paid for a house that was only used for 8 weeks in the summer. And even when they were there, the lifestyle had collapsed. The staff of 40 was gone. It was impossible to hire that many people. The domestic labor market had vanished. Who wanted to scrub marble floors for 12 hours a day when they could work in a factory or an office? Gladys tried to hold on. She and her family lived in a small section of the house, leaving the vast majority of the rooms shuttered and dark. Imagine the scene. A solitary countess, sitting in a library built for a giant, reading by the light of a single lamp, surrounded by acres of cold, dark stone. The house was closing in on her. Around her, Newport was dying. The other cottages were falling. The owners, desperate to escape the tax burden, were walking away. Some houses were sold for pennies. Some were turned into boarding schools. Some were simply abandoned, left to the seagulls and the salt air. The wrecking balls were swinging on Bellevue Avenue. Developers were looking at the land with hungry eyes. They didn't see history. They saw subdivisions. They imagined tearing down the breakers and replacing it with 50 ranch houses. In 1948, the crisis reached a breaking point. Gladys Vanderbilt Shachny faced a choice. She could sell the land to developers and walk away with a fortune, ensuring the destruction of her father's masterpiece. Or she could do something radical. She chose the radical option. She approached the newly formed Preservation Society of Newport County. This was a ragtag group of locals who were desperate to save the architectural heritage of the town. They had enthusiasm, but they didn't have money. Gladys made them an offer that sounds like a fairy tale. She offered to lease the breakers to the Preservation Society for the sum of $1 a year. There was a catch, of course. She would open the ground floor, the great hall, the dining room, the music room, to the public. The society could sell tickets to tourists to pay for the upkeep. But she, Gladys, would keep the third floor. She would maintain a private apartment upstairs. She would live above the museum. It was a deal that saved the house, but it created a surreal existence. In the summer of 1948, the doors opened. For the first time, the common people, the very people the iron gates were built to exclude, walked in. They paid their dollar and stared in open-mouthed wonder at the red alabaster columns and the platinum walls. They tracked mud onto the carpets. They touched the velvet. Upstairs, hidden away in the attic rooms that had once housed the servants, the Countess listened. She could hear the murmur of the tour below. She could hear the footsteps of the public in her living room. It was a bizarre inversion of the social order. The Queen was hiding in the attic while the peasants toured the throne room. But this arrangement worked. The Breakers was a sensation. It became the crown jewel of Newport tourism. The money from the tickets poured in, allowing the Preservation Society to fix the roof, clean the stone, and pay the taxes. The house began to pay for itself. It had transitioned from a private indulgence to a public industry. Gladys Vanderbilt died in 1965. With her death, the last direct link to the Gilded Age was severed. But the family didn't leave immediately. Her daughter, Countess Sylvia Shapery, continued the arrangement. She lived on the third floor for decades, a fierce guardian of the house, terrified that the Preservation Society would turn it into a circus. She fought to keep it dignified. She fought to keep the spirit of the Vanderbilts alive, even as the world outside moved into the disco era and the digital age. The final, lingering presence of the family in the house ended only recently, in the 21st century, when the Preservation Society finally took full control, citing safety codes and the need to modernize the systems. The private apartment was vacated. The family photos were packed up. The last Vanderbilt left the building. Today, the Breakers stands as a survivor. It is the last Leviathan. When you walk through it now, the experience is visceral. The first thing that hits you is the smell. It smells of old stone, floor wax, and the sea. It is a cold, mineral scent that speaks of permanence. As you stand in the great hall, looking up at the painted sky, you realize the magnitude of what Cornelius Vanderbilt II achieved. He wanted to build something that would last forever, and in a strange, twisted way, he succeeded. He didn't build a home for his family. His family fractured, fled, and died. He built a monument to an idea. He built a physical manifestation of the American dream in its most extreme, steroid-fueled form. The Breakers tells us that in America, you can start as a ferry boat captain and end up living in a palace that makes the Medicis look modest. It tells us that with enough money, you can bend reality. You can import a French room to Rhode Island. You can build a mountain of limestone on a swamp. But it also tells us the cost. It stands as a warning. It is a monument to loneliness. You can feel the isolation in the vastness of the rooms. You can feel the pressure that crushed Cornelius II. You can feel the sadness of Gertrude, trapped in her gilded cage. The house is beautiful, but it is not warm. It is a machine designed to impress strangers, not to comfort children. The preservation of the Breakers is a miracle of logistics. It is a constant war against the elements. The salt air that makes Newport beautiful is also a corrosive acid. It eats the limestone. It rusts the iron gates. It rots the window frames. The Preservation Society spends millions of dollars a year just to keep the house standing still. They are the new army of servants fighting a forever war against entropy. They are replacing the slate roof, tile by heavy tile. They are scrubbing the stone with lasers. They are conserving the tapestries with microscopic precision. They are doing the work that Cornelius's fortune used to do, funded now not by railroad stocks, but by the $20 tickets of tourists from Ohio and Japan and Germany. The irony is absolute. The house was built to exclude the public, and now it exists entirely for the public. It was built to demonstrate the power of a single family, and now it demonstrates the power of the collective to save history. As you exit the house, stepping out of the shadows of the loggia and back into the bright, harsh light of the Rhode Island coast, you look back at the grey cliff of stone. It looks dead in a way. The windows are dark. There is no smoke rising from the chimneys. There are no carriages in the drive. But it is not dead. It is a time capsule. It is a stopped clock, frozen at the exact moment of America's greatest imperial ambition. It is the tombstone of the Gilded Age, the largest and loudest and most magnificent headstone in the cemetery of American aristocracy. The Vanderbilts are gone. The railroads are bankrupt or nationalized. The steamships are scrap metal. The fortune is dissipated, but the house remains. The Breakers holds the line against the ocean, a silent, stony witness to the folly and the glory of the men who thought they could buy immortality. The gates are closing now. The tour is over. But the house will be there tomorrow, and the day after that, waiting for the next generation to come and stare at the platinum walls and wonder what it was like to be a king in a country that claims to have none. This has been the Manor Files.